Dr. Cindy Russell is Executive Director of Physicians for Safe Technology, a nonprofit group formed in the U.S. to educate physicians and the public about the science, risks, and the safer use of wireless technology.
Hi, I'm Dr. Cindy Russell, and my talk today is Toxins to Towers, a primer on the science of wireless health effects. I would like to thank Libby Kelly and all the organizers of this incredible conference. I'm very pleased and honored to be able to talk to you today. I trained at Stanford in plastic and reconstructive surgery over 25 years ago, and early on in my career, I joined our local county medical association, environmental health committee, and learned a lot about a broad variety of toxins, especially those in Silicon Valley, which is the heart of the tech industry. And at the same time, I was witnessing the epidemic of breast cancer in my practice. And I was learning about all of these persistent environmental toxins that were stored in breast milk and also in breast tissue. And I began to connect the dots between environmental health. Karen Massey, project attorney for NRDC in 1979, said most Americans are probably unaware of either the pervasiveness of non-ionizing radiation or the controversy surrounding its status as a pollutant and health hazard. We fast forward 40 years, and Jeffrey Shuren of the FDA states now, based on the FDA's ongoing evaluation, the available epidemiological and cancer incidence data continues to support the agency's position that there are no quantifiable adverse health effects in humans caused by exposures at or under the current cell phone exposure limits. Well, that's quite curious because there is so much evidence and scientific evidence we're going to talk about today. Well, I became curious in 2010 when there was a proposal to put a cell tower in my daughter's school. And I didn't really know anything about wireless technology at the time or its harm. We had Wi-Fi, we had a deck phone, and several neighbors got together. We were concerned, and we went to the school board, and we learned that there were cell tower health effects. There was not as much information available at that time, but there were several studies that showed if you lived near a cell tower that you have an abundance of these neurological symptoms, including headaches, insomnia, fatigue, memory loss, depression, and that when the cell towers were removed, those symptoms went away. So we approached the school board, and they eventually rejected this proposal, but they did so mostly because one of the parents said, well, you can go ahead and put this cell tower on the school, but the $12,000 a year that you're going to get is going to be a losing proposition for you because we're not going to be funding you for the school foundation, and you're going to lose a lot more money than $12,000. So that is why it was denied. But it did spark my interest in wireless technology and health harms that has been present since. I put on a conference on wireless technology in Mountain View in 2015, co-founded Physicians for Safe Technology, and also wrote a paper on 5G public health implications. So I've learned a lot, and I'm going to share that with you today. I learned that wireless radiation acts as a toxicant. A toxicant is usually used when referring to a toxic substance that's produced by or a byproduct of man-made activities. There are 4 types of toxic exposures. There's chemical, biological, physical, and radiation. And a toxin is usually used when referring to a toxic substance produced naturally. A toxicant is used when referring to a toxic substance that's produced by man-made activities. And all of the toxins that we get exposed to are preventable risk factors for disease. And we're becoming acutely aware of that. We know that toxic exposures affect health. There's cumulative harm, both in harm from just DNA damage or damage to other structures over time from toxic exposures, but also many of the chemicals we get exposed to they are stored in our bodies, in our fat and in our breast tissue and prostate tissue, and cause cumulative harm from that. We also have synergistic toxic exposures. We're never just exposed to one toxin at a time, and they all have an effect. A lot of these toxins affect many organs, not just one system. And we know that there are vulnerable populations, such as pregnant women, children, and the elderly, who are affected more. Nutrition and genetics have a definite impact on our response to toxic exposures. We know that toxic exposures cause disease. We know cancer can be caused by benzene, asbestos, arsenic, Teflon, solvents, and 100 more chemicals that we are exposed to. Reproductive failure, infertility. We know that DDT and other pesticides can cause this. Brain dysfunction, lead, mercury, PCBs, pesticides, fluorides, flame retardants. For autoimmune disease, we know that formaldehyde can cause this disease. We know that organic solvents and hair dyes can also cause autoimmune disease. And many of these toxins cause developmental abnormalities in many aspects, any parts of the growing fetus and their brain, reproductive, and immune systems. And it's interesting, we have an inventory of about 40,000 chemicals now in the United States, but it's interesting to think about how many are banned. And when we look, there's only about 11 chemicals in the United States that have been banned or restricted. And the EU also has a chemical program, this risk reduction, and they have banned about 1,300 chemicals. So we haven't done a very good job reducing chemical toxins in our environment, and we're learning we haven't done a good job with wireless technology either. We know that the mechanism of action for chemical toxicity, one of them is oxidation or creation of reactive oxygen species. We know that diesel exhaust induces reactive oxygen species in bronchial tissues. Lead, mercury, arsenic, organophosphate pesticides, and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, they all induce oxidative stress by depleting the major intracellular antioxidant that we have, glutathione. We have differences in our oxidation genes, and that may affect our sensitivity to heavy metal toxicity and other chemicals that we get exposed to, and that means we have sensitive populations. So what are reactive oxygen species? Well, reactive oxygen species and oxidation occur when an atom or a molecule loses an electron, and then it becomes very unstable and creates these free radicals, and they want to basically react with other substances that are nearby. And in non-living systems, it's equivalent to rust. We all understand that concept of oxidation. And in biological systems, we actually need reactive oxygen species. They're biologic signaling molecules, and it's part of the normal process. It's used in angiogenesis, in vasomotor control, in platelet aggregation, but also a response to infection and toxins. But if there's overproduction and we're not able to neutralize those reactive oxygen species, then we actually create harm to the critical biological molecules, the DNA, lipids, and this leads to inflammation, disease, and aging. So what about wireless radiation as a toxicant? Radio frequencies, I have found, are a biologic and environmental toxicant. They have very many similarities to chemical toxins. We can't feel them, we can't hear them, we can't see them, they're silent. But there is damage on a cellular level. There's broad effects on all living organisms, and also there's cumulative damage. We know that cancer takes decades of exposure sometimes to create disease. And also, these products have been introduced and commercialized without adequate testing. There is abundant, robust science that shows health impacts of wireless technology and harm to our neurologic system, our reproductive system, hematologic, immunologic, and also carcinogenic effects. We know that these wireless devices, they are extremely convenient. Most of my patients now come in with a smartwatch. Everybody's got a cell phone. We have Wi-Fi at home. Everything connects, even some of our appliances and so forth are now connecting to wireless devices. And all of that takes connection to these cell towers that are now coming closer and closer to where we live. Wireless data is transmitted through the air as electromagnetic radiation. The antennas in your cell phone are both transmitters and receivers, and these old phones used to have antennas that would, just like a TV antenna. Now the antennas have been hidden in the cell phone, and we have about 4 to 6 antennas in our cell phones now. Wi-Fi, cellular, Bluetooth, GPS, and 5G, they're all at different wavelengths. And so when we use our phone, we're getting a mix of waves, and these have different modulation, different frequency, different heights, different pulsations, all of which have different risks to biologic health. This is a NASA slide that shows the devices, different devices and different frequencies that are being emitted constantly from these devices that we don't see or hear or feel unless we're electrosensitive. The electromagnetic spectrum is shown here, and if you look on the right side, we have on the right side of visible light, we have ionizing radiation, and ionizing radiation will knock an electron out of its orbit and cause harm in that manner. To the left, we see the longer waves that are lower energy, and they do not knock an electron out of the orbit, but they can still cause harm, and we're going to talk about that through non-ionizing methods, mechanisms. And these waves are quite long. Radio waves can be 60 miles wide. The microwave radiation is what we're talking about to the left there, and these microwaves are inches to feet. That is the 2G, 3G, and 4G. When we talk about 5G, we're talking about millimeter waves, and those are really tiny, small waves that are millimeters. They're the size of insects, and that's one of the reasons why they can harm insects. We are increasingly exposed to more and more radiation. This is a slide by Phillips and Lambert, and this really is a nice demonstration of what's happened over the years. If you look in the bottom, the green is the natural background radiation in the 1920s, and you can see that in the 1950s, with the development of military radar and radio as well, you can see that has now increased the radiation levels. In the 1980s, there's a continued increase in military use, and then it's starting to have commercialized use. And now in the 2010, you can see that we're having increase in the higher frequencies, and that's your Wi-Fi and your cell phone and so forth. The higher frequencies to the right are up to 300 gigahertz, and there's terahertz they want to use now. And there's a spectrum that's been auctioned, and to this graph is going to be filling in to the right more with all these much higher frequencies and spectrum use over time. Again, we're going to find out the problem with that. So there's a lot of controversy. People go, well, wireless isn't, I don't have any symptoms. It's fine. I think that there's no real science to it. There's no real harm. But why is there such controversy? And you have people say there's a lot of harm and we have to be careful. So the reason why it's so difficult is because it's a complex subject. It's multidisciplinary. You use engineering, biology, medicine, physics, math. Our experts are all needed, and sometimes they need to talk to each other, and it's hard to understand somebody else's, expertise. The effects are variable and they're nonlinear, so some people will have an effect at one frequency but not at another. The studies are done under different conditions. They have different times of exposure. They may have different frequencies and different pulsations. There's also differences in genetics and nutrition and other toxic exposures. And also when you're looking at these, we have biological effects that are seen, but how do those translate into health effects? And that's always a difficult question. Then there is the ever-present industry influence. And a good read is FCC Captured Agency. That'll tell you one of the reasons why there's such controversy. So physicists say they are always having an argument with biologists. And I've heard many people say, oh, I have a friend who's a physicist, and they say there's no way it could be harmful. Ionizing radiation, it can't break up, it breaks a bond and it moves electrons, so it can be harmful. It ionizes substances. It ionizes our cells and molecules in us. But the physicists say it's not strong enough to injure cells. It's just not. But the biologists come back and they say, you know what? We've seen all of these adverse biological effects that are demonstrated both in vitro and in vivo studies. And their oxidation has found to be a universal non-thermal mechanism of toxicity for this radio frequency radiation, the non-ionizing radiation. It's interesting to note that now there are physicists who are now turning around and saying, we are now finding that spin physics explains all this. So, it's very interesting discussion. So, what about oxidation? Yes, indeed, there is a large body of evidence that's growing that oxidation is a mechanism of toxicity for wireless radiation. And Yankomenko in 2016, he looked at 100 studies and found 93 of those were positive for oxidation effects. Alai in 2020 looked at 261 studies, found 240 were positive for oxidation. That's 91%. And you can find this on the Bioinitiative site. And Yakimenko says that this does explain the range of biological and health effects of low-intensity radiofrequency radiation, which include both cancer and non-cancer pathologies. Well, there is biologic damage to cellular molecules from this wireless radiofrequency radiation. It's demonstrated in the literature. There's DNA damage, there's lipid peroxidation, membrane injury, and mitochondrial injury. There's oxidation damage to cells, and this is seen in the literature as well. And you can find the literature on our website at mdsafetech.org or physiciansforsafetechnology.org. And it's demonstrated in sperm and ovaries and embryo, nerve cells, cardiac cells, blood cells, and immune system. And it's interesting, we have a whole section of literature also that shows that antioxidants prevent that adverse effect. And the researchers will show the oxidation, then they'll add vitamins A, C, E, and they'll even add melatonin and show that the damaging effect is prevented and it protects the cells. That's why it's important to have your antioxidants. So oxidation stress leads to inflammation, and this leads to human disease. It's very well studied now in the literature, and last year the National Institute of Health 2019 had a whole talk on cancer and inflammation. Several studies that are on our site indicate this. Lurchi wrote on this in 2015 on cancer. Kasari wrote on reproductive harm, neurologic dysfunction, Alzheimer's disease, cardiac disease, immune suppression. All these studies indicate that there is a cause and effect. So wireless radiation. We know that this wireless radiation passes through our bodies, and the longer the wavelengths, the deeper that it penetrates. So the 2G, 3G, 4G, they're all longer wavelengths, and they absorb variably through the body. The shorter wavelengths, the 5G, are millimeter waves, and they penetrate only the skin. They can still have an effect, but they penetrate the skin. And wireless radiation is absorbed by anything containing water. If you have metal, it is refracted and is not absorbed. The wireless radiation can harm cellular processes, as we're learning, and we get exposed to a mix of artificial electromagnetic frequencies. And we do know we're electrical beings. Our hearts, our brain, our nervous system, our endocrine system, they all depend upon this very minute electrical signaling. So it makes sense that this could be interfered with through membrane and other effects. Children are more vulnerable. Their skulls are thinner. There's a higher content of water in the brain. And this study from Fernandez and Davis et al. Show that there is a higher absorption in children, both for cell phones and virtual reality. The children's organ systems are not developed, and they're immature, and they're much more vulnerable to harm and injury, and also they have a longer life, so they have a longer exposure with these devices. And that's why it's so important not to have children exposed to this technology long term. So let's look at the brain. It's the most important organ of the body. It allows us to have memory, to speak, to have thought processes, and basically for survival. What we're finding with wireless radiation is that it acts as a neurotoxin. There are many studies that show loss of brain cells in the hippocampus, and this is our memory center. Studies show demyelination of nerve cells, a decrease in neurotransmitter levels, disruption of the blood-brain barrier, and DNA damage. Wireless radiation opens up the blood-brain barrier, and this blood-brain barrier is very tight, and it prevents toxins and cells from entering. It prevents pathogens from entering. But if the blood-brain barrier is damaged, then not only toxins can enter, but also immune cells, and this could account for some of the neuroinflammation. Dr. Salford has spent 20 years working on blood-brain barrier effects of radiofrequency radiation. And he actually found that in some of the studies with even just 2 hours of exposure, there are many weeks that the blood-brain barrier remains open. He's also demonstrated neuronal damage in the cortex, the hippocampus, and basal ganglia. An important study was done by Mayo and published in 2018 on looking at high school students and the effects of nearby cell tower radiation. This was a 2-year study, and he used 2 schools. One had a higher emission of 10 microwatts per centimeter squared, and the other at 2 microwatts per centimeter squared. And he did neuropsychological testing. He accounted for confounding factors. He actually did this study twice. And he found that the teens at the school with the higher emissions had significantly lower cognitive scores, delayed fine and gross motor skills, reduced spatial working memory. Electrohypersensitivity, a phenomenon where individuals experience adverse health effects while using or being in the vicinity of devices emanating electrical, magnetic, or electromagnetic fields. Their electrohypersensitivity is also known as microwave illness, microwave sickness, microwave syndrome, electrosensitivity. There's many terms for it. It was first seen in military radar personnel in the 1940s, but today it's not really recognized or acknowledged by mainstream medical community today. And that's why it's really important to have these conferences and let doctors know that this is a real entity. It's been considered to be a psychiatric illness by many people's standards. There's a wide variety of non-specific symptoms. Different frequencies affect people differently. We've talked about that before. And Belpom in 2015 had a seminal paper looking at biomarkers that were common in both people who had electrohypersensitivity and multiple chemical sensitivity. And some of these were inflammatory markers. So this indicates that there may be diagnostic tools to actually identify people that have this syndrome. Now, symptoms of electrosensitivity, there are varied. There are skin symptoms, stinging, itching, burning, erythema, which is redness of the skin, rosacea, sweating. There are also neurologic symptoms, headache, dizziness, insomnia, memory changes, irritability, and depression, cardiovascular with heart palpitations. And many studies have shown that these symptoms can develop over time. They may not develop right away, but with increasing exposure, these symptoms can develop. This is not a new syndrome. NASA described this in a 1981 report on microwave illness, and they looked at occupational injury and those who worked in radar, and they showed symptoms of headaches, irritability, the same symptoms, fatigue, dizziness. They had mental depression, pain in the muscles, loss of hair, breathing difficulties, the same symptoms. And this report can be found on our website. We have a whole section on military and government reports. It has many reports that have described these symptoms. Dr. Scott Eberly is on our advisory board, and he wrote a wonderful article called What's the Diagnosis, Doctor? And I highly recommend it. He developed electrosensitivity after a carbon monoxide poisoning. And while he was recovering, he discovered that he could no longer use his cell phone or his computer. And he thought he was crazy. He looked at the literature. He's very smart and thought, wow, is this a psychosomatic problem? What is this? And he had his colleagues help him do some double-blind studies or blinded studies. And he found, yes, he could identify each time that the computer or the cell phone was on because he developed symptoms. And all of these symptoms, headaches, dizziness, nausea, heart palpitations, irritability, insomnia. And I highly recommend this article to anybody who believes this is not or doesn't believe that this is a real entity. He's an eloquent writer. He's also wrote another article in Underworld Journey, Learning to Cope with Electromagnetic Hypersensitivity. And I think he's contributed a lot to understanding this issue and understanding that this is a real phenomenon. And he wrote this in his Sonoma Medical Association Journal, and we had this reprinted in our Santa Clara County Medical Association Bulletin. Who else experiences electrosensitivity? Well, firefighters. As it winds up, when they first put first responder cell towers near or on fire stations, a number of firefighters experienced within a week this syndrome of headaches, extreme fatigue, sleep disruption, unexplained anger, depression, and profound memory loss. There were firefighters on a 911 call that got lost in the city they grew up in. There were firefighters who forgot CPR. And this was so pronounced that in 2004, the International Association of Firefighters, they commissioned a study to look at these firefighters. And they found indeed in brain scans that there was evidence of trauma that was not due to chemicals that they were exposed to. They developed a resolution in 2004 that's quite extensive. You can find it on our website, to have these cell towers removed from their fire stations and not have them placed. And they actually codified this in California AB 57 in 2016. And they are exempt from having cell towers on their fire stations because they say, well, we have to be of sound mind and we have to respond to emergencies, and these are causing neurologic symptoms. So this is actually codified in California state law. Bevington wrote a wonderful article about those who have electrohypersensitivity, and he did a review and found that there are many that are disabled. They can't even work. He estimates that 5 to 30% of people have mild EHS, 1.5 to 5% have moderate EHS, and 0.65% have restricted access to work. And that's about 500,000 people in the UK and about 2 million people in the United States. And this is really serious because that's a lot of people. And these people are, in essence, they're refugees, or EMF refugees. They can't work, they can't go shopping, they can't go to the movies, they can't use their electronic devices, and they have to be away from it. And this is really important. It needs to be recognized, and a very serious problem. Well, let's look at some of the population studies with regards to brain effects on memory, behavior, and learning. And Lee, who finished an article in 2020, he looked at about 1,500 mother-child pairs, and he followed them in utero to over 20 years. And he looked at the different levels of radiofrequency radiation they were exposed to. And he found that at the highest level, the highest tier, was associated with ADHD. And this was a really good study. He used an exposometer and measured the radiation close to them. In 2017, Birx looked at 83,000 mother-child pairs in 5 countries, and he also found the same thing, that increased maternal cell use was associated with more ADHD and emotional problems. Forrester looked at 22 Swiss schools and found decreased memory scores with increased phone use. And Ma in 2017 looked at children from age 6 months to 2 years, about 800 children, and looked at their speech and found that, and their speech and also how much they were using digital devices, and found for each 30-minute increase in screen time, they had a 49% increased risk of expressive speech delay. And I think this was instrumental in really indicating to the American Academy of Pediatrics that this was a real problem. And that's why they recommend no use of digital technology before the age of 2, unless it's FaceTime, and rarely. We all know that internet addiction is an increasing problem in children and teens and adults. In the last decade, there was a series of studies that were developed by psychiatrists and radiologists that were collaborating, and they looked at brain scans in those who were internet addicted, and they found that there was impaired white matter and impaired gray matter. With the white matter, they found that this was in the frontal cortex and areas that are associated with memory, attention planning, and prioritizing tasks. And in the gray matter, they found this was in the prefrontal cortex and cerebellum, in areas that control the loss of impulse control and increased risky behavior. This was time dependent, and the longer the addiction, the more severe the structural brain shrinkage. Wang in 2016 did another extensive study looking at MRI images, again, in college students who had overuse of the cell phone, and he found the same thing with the white matter and the gray matter in exactly the same areas. And in one of the studies, they said, why does it take brain scans of children's brain shrinking for us to realize a digital technology should not be used. It's harmful. So reproduction, of course, is important for sustaining our species. There are many studies that show risk to reproduction. On our website at mdsafetech.org, we have 54 studies that show sperm damage, structural alteration, decreased motility, DNA damage, and decreased testosterone. We have studies that show ovarian damage. Again, this is oxidation studies, embryo damage, and miscarriage. Dr. Lee, a Kaiser physician, has been doing research on this for decades, and he did a wonderful study published in 2017. He looked at 913 pregnant women, and he controlled for other factors. He put exposometers, which are radiation monitors, on these women and asked them to have a regular day and have regular exposure. And he found that in the highest tier of exposure, there was a 3-fold increase in miscarriage. And he concluded that miscarriage is a sensitive indicator of EMF harm. And the reason this is a really important study is that it was so well done. Nobody could refute his findings. It was in Reuters, it was in New York Times, and people actually came up to me, and when they saw it, they said, Cindy, maybe you're right. Maybe there is something to this. There's hematologic abnormalities that have been found. Jabril did a review of reviews over 20 years and found that the results were variable in terms of hematologic effects. It depended upon the time of exposure, the power, and the frequency. But he did indicate there's deformity, destruction, and decrease in red blood cells. There's a decrease in white cells, increase in platelets, and rouleau formation after even 15 minutes on a Nokia phone. The Weston Price Foundation put on a pilot study that's quite interesting. They published this in 2015. They took 10 healthy subjects. They were on a strict diet. And they had 3 baseline tests, baseline 45 minutes receiving and 45 minutes active cell phone use. And they did live blood analysis and with peripheral blood smears underneath the microscope. And they found that after 45 minutes of receiving, there was rouleau formation or clumping of the red cells. And with active cell phone use, there was rouleau formation along with abnormal shape. And the interesting thing was they thought that maybe they were just getting this rouleau formation locally in the finger when they were doing the finger stick because of the cell phone. So they took simultaneous samples of the toe and finger stick, and they found the exact same rouleau formation. So they concluded that this effect was systemic and is really concerning. Concerning. The immune system effects. We know the immune system has influence over the reproductive system, the neurologic system, and the endocrine system. And if you damage the immune system, you damage many other broad aspects of our functioning. The immune system, of course, consists of not only cells, but cytokines, hormones, and neurotransmitters. It's a very complex field. But in general, a lot of these studies have shown influence and adverse effects. Some have shown some beneficial effects, but some adverse effects on white cells, our mononuclear cells, our lymphocytes, T cells, and so forth. And they have evidence of oxidative damage as well. When I was reviewing this for a talk on immune toxicity, I found one of the interesting studies was historical. The USSR developed a number of research projects and studies on radiofrequency radiation in the Kiev Institute of Public Hygiene in the 1970s to the 1990s. And they looked at immune toxicity as their endpoint and antibody formation and also autoantibodies. And these studies were used to set the exposure standards for radiofrequency radiation in the USSR, which are currently lower than the US. And their conclusion was that available data allow the conclusion that the immune system is a critical system for evaluation of the effect of RF at low intensity and should be taken into consideration for development of standards. And that's exactly what they did. Russia still maintains a standard of 10 microwatts per centimeter squared, as does Italy, Bulgaria, and Poland. China has a bit higher, but the United States maintains at 1,000 microwatts per centimeter squared, and that's depending upon the frequency. But they've maintained a lower standard. Other European countries have gone higher, but they've listened to their own really valid science. What about cancer? the United States has the 5th highest cancer incidence in the world, and it's increasing. It's a burden to not only populations and humans, but also the healthcare system. The International Agency for Research on Cancer in 2011 listed radiofrequency radiation as a Class 2B possible carcinogen, and there are scientists today that are asking for this to be elevated to a known carcinogen because of the increasing robust science. We know that DNA damage can lead to cancer. Oxidation is a major factor in DNA damage, and DNA repair mechanisms are always at work. But if the accumulation of DNA damage is more than the repair mechanisms, then of course then we have mutations. And we know that there are gene variants in DNA repair enzymes such as the BRCA gene for breast cancer, and they're associated with a higher probability of developing cancer and maybe more sensitive population with regards to EMR. Everyone mentions this. It's a very large study, the NTP study, National Toxicology Program study on cell phones and cancer, was developed by the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. Was a 10-year study, $30 million, and their conclusions were there's a significant association with cancer of the heart, brain, adrenal medulla, and prostate. Another interesting finding was they did not expect was cardiomyopathy or aging of the heart, and this is consistent with the oxidative effects. And many people have supported this, and this study. Well, how about brain cancer and cell phone use? Hardell and Karlberg have done abundant research that shows significant association of brain tumors and cell and cordless phone use on the same side of the head after about 1,680 hours of use. And people say, well, we haven't seen a rise in brain tumor rates yet. But now the statistics are showing there is a rise in brain tumors in England and France, and also brain tumors are the most common cancer in those from 0 to 19. In the United States, there's about 300 million cell phone subscribers and 13 lawsuits against cell phone manufacturers claiming that the cell phones cause their brain tumor. And they've all failed in the courts so far. And that is because telecom lawyers, they state that the plaintiff's claims are preempted by federal law, which considers that all cell phones that comply with the prescribed SAR standards are safe. However, in Italy, there are 6 courts in 4 cases that have ruled since 2009 that there's a causal link between cell phone use and brain tumors. And they found that the industry studies were flawed and biased, and they were not considered in the scientific evidence. And they made their determination largely from the large body of really careful epidemiological studies and research that was done by Dr. Leonard Hardell and his colleagues from Sweden. Brain tumor rates are rising in France, and this is from PhoneGate, Dr. Azari, in his website called PhoneGate, Phone Alert rather. We know that brain cancer is rising in youth. That's the most common cancer, ages 0 to 14. There's been an increase in brain tumors in those that are less than 30, looking at the studies from 1992 to 2006. Well, what about occupational exposure? The military and soldiers who are working in radar have a much higher exposure than average citizen, although with now cell towers, if you're near a cell tower, that may not be the case if you're close. But they looked at he looked at hemolymphatic cancers, and he found that there was definitely a significant increased risk of these cancers in those who work in the military settings around radar. The Polish study showed a 36% observed versus 12%, Israeli defense industry 60% versus 17%, and Belgian radar battalions 8.3 versus 1.4, and overall 40% observed versus 23 expected. So it's a really good study showing increased incidence of cancer in occupational settings. So cell towers and cancer, Wolf and Wolf, Eager and Dode, they've written on increased incidence of cancer near cell towers within about 1,200 feet or within that. And these are all on our website. What about epigenetic changes? Well, epigenetics relates to heritable non-mutation changes. basically that are, they don't involve changes in the nucleotides or the base of the DNA, but they do affect the structure of the DNA, and that they add methylation is one common method of epigenetic change that actually can be inherited. And this epigenetic change can actually alter not the DNA, but it can alter the expression of the DNA and the expression of genes. So one of the things that they found is that environmental toxins like bisphenol A, they can affect tumor suppressor genes. So you can have a tumor suppressor gene, it's a tumor suppressor gene that if it's methylated, it's not going to work very well. And this is found in many cancers, and they're thinking that this is one of the mechanisms of tumor promotion. And there can be transgenerational alterations in this DNA repair mechanism. And this may be related to stem cell reprogramming into a cancer stem cell. So with regards to electromagnetic radiation and carcinogenicity, there have been studies that have shown some epigenetic changes. Tillman, Lurchie, Dostog have shown this, some with microRNA, and more studies need to be done. Eva Markova did an amazing study in 2010 that she published on mobile phones and DNA repair in stem cells. Mesenchymal stem cells are undifferentiated. They haven't really become what they want to be yet. So if it's a stem cell in the heart, it hasn't yet become a heart cell. Stem cells in the liver haven't really differentiated yet. And because they're undifferentiated, they're at a higher risk of malignant transformation. So what she did, she exposed these mesenchymal stem cells to 1 hour of low-level non-thermal microwave exposure. And she found that there was a highly significant decrease in the DNA repair foci. And that is the DNA, when it's broken, it's surrounded by all these proteins and so forth. And she found that these were significantly decreased. And this level, the SAR level, is about half of what the exposure levels are for long-term public exposure. So these are environmentally relevant exposures. And she concluded that this study was confirming the epidemiologic data that showed an association of a prolonged microwave exposure with brain cancer risk. So it's a very important study. That the FCC standards are outdated. They're based on short-term thermal heating. They're not based on the biological effects that we've discussed. They don't consider vulnerable populations like the fetus, babies, elderly, chronic illness. They don't consider those who are electrosensitive. And we know that there is a bona fide mechanism for harm from wireless radiation that's non-thermal, and these are not, they're not considered in their deliberations. And in fact, now there is a lawsuit going forward by Environmental Health Trust and Children's Health Defense that states that the FCC has basically not considered these, and they have not protected populations because of it. The Bioinitiative report came out, has a lot of research on it. It identifies that this research shows that biological effects occur at non-thermal levels. These are environmentally relevant, they're at everyday levels, and they recommend a precautionary limit that should be adopted, which is much lower than the current limit. And it's a wonderful read, and they have great summaries at bioinitiative.org. The FCC standards need reevaluation. The American Academy of Pediatrics has asked for this. The California Department of Public Health, they didn't come out and state this, but they said there may be harm from these studies, and we need to reduce your exposure. Austrian Medical Association, California Medical Association, the Government Accountability have all asked for reevaluation of safety standards. And the American Academy of Pediatrics came out in 2013 stating that the FCC needs to reassess the current policy to protect children's health and well-being, to reflect current use patterns, and to provide meaningful consumer disclosure. California Medical Association resolution in 2014. Second resolve shows that the CMA support efforts to implement new safety exposure limits for wireless devices to levels that do not cause human or environmental harm based on scientific research. The European Council Resolution 1815 is a wonderful report, and they also asked to reconsider the scientific basis for the present standards, and they asked to reduce exposures to the LARA, which is as low as reasonably achievable. They asked for schools to give preference to wired internet connections, pay attention to electrosensitive people, and create wave-free areas that are not covered by a wireless network. The European EMF Guideline 2016 for the prevention, diagnosis, and treatment of EMF-related health problems and illness also is an essential report. They have a lot of science that you can read. They have summaries, and I think this is one of the seminal reports that everyone should read if they are interested in electrosensitivity. They asked that, and they state that electrosensitivity is an environmental illness, and the treatment is basically to reduce EMF exposure at home and in public places. And it's interesting that, in reading through this, the Swiss Society of Doctors for the Environment, they developed a clinic in 2008 to diagnose and treat EMR-related disease with a standard protocol, and would love to see this in the United States. Well, while we have 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G is, we've got a race to 5G, and this is a manufactured technology, a manufactured need. We don't need 5G. 5G now is going to be 2G, 3G, 4G, and now they're going to add millimeter waves to this, and largely for streaming. But there are significant health risks that haven't been looked at, and these health risks to the millimeter waves are eye damage, skin injury, bacterial resistance, a widespread metabolic disturbance, and skin signaling, and also effects on insects, because these millimeter waves can have resonance effects and injure insects. And you can't separate these from the other risks that 5G has, which are privacy, security, liability, climate change, as there's going to be a threefold increase in energy use with the use of 5G, and also the loss of critical landlines. So this is something that needs careful attention. What is wireless radiation? Is an experiment. There's no controls, there's no monitoring, there's no informed consent. And when Senator Blumenthal asked Senate Commerce Committee hearing, he asked industry, well, are you doing any safety tests? And they said no. Well, there's no safety tests, there's no monitoring, there's no health studies. Well, it's no problem, because industry's done this before. They've done it with tobacco, asbestos, lead, flame retardants, plastics. Leonard Hardell and Rainer Nyberg, in an Appeals That Matter article, state that there seems to be an unholy alliance between the telecom industry and certain scientists, organizations, even WHO, and some politicians, thus reducing the potential for precautionary actions. And it's a serious problem. Nobody's calling for precaution. And what can you do? Well, you want to get wired to reduce your exposure. Time matters. The shorter you're on a call, the better. Distance matters. The farther you are from the radiation emitting device, the better. You want preferred wired connections over wireless. You don't want to sleep with your phone near your head. You want to put it on airplane mode. You want to turn off your wireless devices and Wi-Fi at night and when you're not in use. And you want to keep your landline and remove your smart meter. These are some articles that I've written on Wi-Fi radiation, including a 5G wireless future, and also wireless silent spring that discusses the environmental impacts, and also a published article, 5G wireless telecommunications expansion, public health and environmental implications. I want to thank you for your time and just advise you to reduce your exposure. And here is Physicians for Safe Technology. Our vision is a world where technology serves our needs without undermining our physical, psychosocial, or environmental health. Thank you so much.